introduce you to a program called Britain Throughout the Ages, A History Through Food. I'm Ellen.
And I'm Sasha. And throughout this program, we'll take you through the different periods in British history, from the Old English period to the Restoration period.
By looking at the different foods and meals that were eaten through these time periods, we will help you better understand the culture of Britain throughout history.
Food is one of the basic necessities of life, and a culture can often be dissected based on the food that the people ate. A thriving society would have more wealth for lavish feasts, whereas a struggling society only eats what is available and inexpensive.
As the old saying goes, the quickest way to a man's heart is through his stomach. We are going to extend the meaning of that saying to declare that the quickest way to analyze a culture is through its stomachs.
So let's begin. To start this program, we will look at the Old English period, a period that lasted from 405 to 1066 Common Era. The end date of this period is very important, as 1066 Common Era was the year when the Romans began the Norman conquest.
The epic poem Beowulf was written in the Old English period, somewhere between the years 700 and 1066. Although there is no known author of Beowulf, this epic poem is often considered to be one of the most important pieces of Anglo-Saxon literature.
By reading Beowulf closely and examining the history of the time period, it is clear that Great Britain was experiencing a time characterized by warfare. Lines 23 to 25 of Beowulf reads, "So young men build the future wisely, open-handed in peace, protected in war so warriors earn their fame and wealth is shaped with a sword."
Due to the political instability of the time and the use of warfare as a weapon to attain power and fame, citizens of Great Britain and during the Old English period did not have much time to put into creating lavish cuisines. Poke rounds, which is a sauce made of honey and pine nuts, was a common food of the time period.
We will make this poke rounds, and we will add it to the bread that we later make during the Renaissance period.
This is poke rounds. So to make poke rounds, first you have to heat the honey in a pot, which we will do here, and then you add ginger and cinnamon to the mixture. So you add a little bit of each, and then you heat it. Then you can add it to the bread later that we make during the Renaissance period.
Next, we will be moving on to the Middle English period. This time period lasted from the year 1066 to 1485, starting with the Norman invasion of England and ending with the production of the printing press.
Johannes Gutenberg's printing press revolutionized literature as Europe switched from oral tradition in the vernacular to written history in languages such as Latin and English. In an attempt to gain a wider range of readers, many books were published in English, helping cement that language and history.
In addition to establishing the English language influence, the invention of the printing press helped end the manuscript culture that was prevalent during the early Middle English period. Books no longer had only one copy, so many more important works of literature have survived the test of time.
As you can see, Great Britain has become much more advanced since the Old English period, so it follows that the food has become more sophisticated as well during the Middle English period.
Now we will cook a common food of the Middle English period, dariels, which is similar to a modern-day quiche.
First, you have to put the eggs in the mixing bowl, and you crack the eggs. And then you mix the eggs, gradually stirring in the cream. Next, you add the salt and the saffron into the mixture, stirring it in. So then you add this into the pie shell, bake it, and then let it cool, and it's ready to serve.
Let's move on to the Renaissance period. The Renaissance period began in the year 1486 and lasted until the early 1600s. This period in time marked the rebirth of humanism and the revival of cultural achievements in all forms of art. The word Renaissance itself is defined as a rebirth or reconstruction.
During this time, artists and musicians produced works that displayed more artistic freedom and individualism. This creativity allowed artists to abandon the stricter ways of the medieval era. Their art forms rediscovered the ancient Greek ideas.
The great masters of the Renaissance were honored in their own lifetimes rather than after their deaths, which was different from most of their medieval predecessors. And with the new printing techniques, music, books, and plays were able to be preserved and distributed to the people.
One of the great writers of the Renaissance period was William Shakespeare, who lived from 1564 to 1616. Shakespeare was a well-known playwright, and his works circulated throughout England during this time. One of these works was Macbeth.
Written between 1603 and 1607, Macbeth is a tragedy about a man who commits murders to gain power, eventually succumbing to the paranoia and guilt. In Macbeth, the Renaissance period is connected to the corruption and murder that Macbeth uses to gain power.
During the Renaissance, food reflects social class, and as a result, food reflected the amount of power the person had in society.
The middle class did not have access to meat on a daily basis, and their breads were made from dark grains such as barley, rye, rather than the more costly wheat.
The wealthy and nobility of the era not only ate more meat and other foods, but also enjoyed a higher quality of food. When the rich were done with their meals, the sauce-soaked bread often was given to the poor.
Today we will be making bread that's similar to the bread that would have been made during the Renaissance period. Later we compared this bread with the poke rounds that we made during the Old English period.
The ingredients that we'll be using in this bread include flour, yeast, salt, sugar, and shortening, which we will be using butter for the shortening. For the yeast today, we dissolved it in warm water, and then we wait about 10 minutes for it to be ready.
We also ground some flour in this stone grounder.
And then we put the flour with the shortening, sugar, and salt in this bowl, and then we mix it with the yeast. Then after we beat this yeast, we wait about 1 hour for it to rise, and then we knead it into bread.
Next, you stir it with 300 vigorous strokes. Good.
Oh, my bread! Next, we will be visiting the Restoration period in England, which began in about 1660 and ended in about 1689. The 17th century in England was characterized by civil war, changes in power, and huge economic development.
During this time, John Milton published his epic poem, Paradise Lost. Though this epic went against the traditional poetry of that time, as he wrote in blank verse, Milton also focused on Christ in his epic instead of writing about England.
Even though Milton did not focus on England in his epic, this is the period that England becomes extremely powerful around the world. However, only the rich benefit from it, and that is reflected in their food choices.
Ranked members of society and those who are unranked but wealthy, including merchants and people involved in the shipping industry, ate mostly white bread, meat, and drank red wine. The meat would usually consist of wild game that would have been hunted locally, and would include deer, goose, and wild and domestic pig.
Vegetables are considered to be in fashion at times, so they would have been consumed. However, the English often considered vegetables to be unhealthy.
The wealthy also relied on imported food. The peasants, on the other hand, ate whatever was available during a particular season. Coarse brown bread, beans, porridge, gruel, and whatever could be gathered locally.
Meat was scarce, mostly because the wealthy owned most of the forests, which was the best hunting ground. To hunt on their property was a crime and had huge consequences. Animals that were raised were lightly eaten, pigs being the most common.
Today we will be cooking the pudding. Today we will be cooking rice pudding, similar to a pudding that would have been made during the Renaissance. Wait, I'm going to start that over.
Next, we will be visiting the Restoration period in England, which began in about 1660 and ended in about 1689. The 17th century in England was characterized by civil war, changes in power, and huge economic development.
During this time, John Milton published his epic poem, Paradise Lost. Though this epic went against the traditional poetry of that time, as he wrote in blank verse, Milton also focused on Christ in his epic instead of writing about England.
Even though Milton did not focus on England in his epic, this is the period that England becomes extremely powerful around the world. However, only the rich benefit from it, and that is reflected in their food choices.
Ranked members of society and those who are unranked but wealthy, including merchants and people involved in the shipping industry, ate mostly white bread, meat, and drank red wine. The meat would usually consist of wild game that would have been hunted locally, and would include deer, goose, and wild and domestic pig.
Vegetables are considered to be in fashion at times, so they would have been consumed. However, the English often considered vegetables to be unhealthy.
The wealthy also relied on imported food. The peasants, on the other hand, ate whatever was available during a particular season. Coarse brown bread, beans, porridge, gruel, and whatever could be gathered locally.
Meat was scarce, mostly because the wealthy owned most of the forests, which was the best hunting ground. To hunt on their property was a crime and had huge consequences. Animals that were raised were lightly eaten, pigs being the most common.
Today we will be cooking rice pudding, similar to a pudding that would have been made during the Restoration period. This is a more complex dessert and would have most likely have been eaten by the wealthy during the Restoration period.
So to make the rice pudding, we have to heat cream, milk, and pepper in a large pot, and to this mixture you add rice, and then heat it on the stove. So after we heat this mixture, we're going to be adding egg yolks, half a cup of brown sugar, and dates. So now we finished cooking our meal, and this is our 4-dish meal. First we have the dariels, which is the modern day quiche, and then the sauce for the Renaissance bread, which is it's called poke rounds.
And then we have the Renaissance bread and the rice pudding.
So we're going to cut the Renaissance bread and add some of our poke round sauce to it for demonstration. We hope that you've learned a lot about the history of England and how the food reflects the culture of the day. Thanks for watching!